Eddie Van Halen had been dropping hints to his band for 3 weeks about a mystery guest who would join them on stage, but refused to reveal the identity. When the moment finally came at the sold-out Forum in Los Angeles, what happened next would become the most emotional moment in rock history. It was September 27, 2007, and the Van Halen reunion tour was already making headlines. David Lee Roth was back, Wolfgang had replaced Michael Anthony on bass, and Eddie seemed healthier than he'd been in years after battling cancer and addiction. But something was different about Eddie's demeanor during sound checks. For 3 weeks, he'd been mysteriously insistent about keeping a 20-minute gap in the set list, right after the guitar solo section. Before we continue with this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss more amazing true stories about rock legends. Alex Van Halen had been trying to extract information for days. During rehearsals at 150 Studios, Alex noticed his brother making phone calls in private, speaking in hushed Dutch. When asked, Eddie simply smiled and said it was a surprise 45 years in the making. Wolfgang was equally curious, but his father remained tight-lipped, only saying this person had made Van Halen possible before Van Halen even existed. David Lee Roth, never one to appreciate being left out, had grown increasingly irritated. During one heated exchange backstage in Vegas, Roth demanded to know who this mystery guest was. Eddie looked at him with an expression Roth later described as a mixture of defiance and deep emotion, saying that some debts take a lifetime to repay, and tonight he was finally going to start. That night at the Forum, 25,000 people packed the arena. The show had been explosive so far, tearing through Runnin' with the Devil, Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love, and Hot for Teacher. But as Eddie launched into his extended guitar solo segment, something unusual happened. Instead of the typical 15-minute showcase, Eddie played for only 8 minutes before abruptly stopping. The arena lights dimmed except for a single spotlight on Eddie, standing center stage with his iconic Frankenstrat guitar. He walked to the microphone, and the crowd noticed something they'd rarely seen in Eddie Van Halen. His hands were trembling slightly, and there were visible tears in his eyes. 25,000 people fell into absolute silence. Eddie spoke slowly, his Dutch accent slightly more pronounced than usual, which always happened when he was emotional. He needed to share something he'd kept private for 45 years, not because he was ashamed, but because the person involved had never wanted recognition. This person had never asked for credit, never sought the spotlight, never tried to benefit from Van Halen's success. Eddie explained that when his family immigrated to Pasadena from Amsterdam in 1962, they arrived with almost nothing. His father Jan struggled to find work. His mother Eugenia worked as a maid. 7-year-old Eddie and Alex faced brutal discrimination at school, mocked for their accents, their second-hand clothes, their immigrant status. The bullying was so severe that Eddie would sometimes hide in the school bathroom during lunch. What the audience didn't know was that during those dark early years, one person had seen potential in the scared little Dutch boy. Eddie paused before continuing. This person worked at a small music repair shop on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena, and when 8-year-old Eddie wandered in one day after running from school bullies, this man did something that would change rock music history forever. He didn't call Eddie's parents or the school. Instead, he handed Eddie a damaged guitar and said something Eddie never forgot. Eddie gestured to the side of the stage. The crowd watched as a man in his late 70s slowly walked out, moving carefully but with quiet dignity. Simply dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight. Eddie embraced him, both men openly crying, before leading him to center stage. His name was Raymond Torres, though everyone in old Pasadena called him Ray. Ray had owned Torres Music Repair on Colorado Boulevard from 1960 until he retired in 1995, fixing guitars and amplifiers for local musicians. He'd been a session musician himself in the 1950s, playing jazz guitar in small clubs, but a hand injury ended his performing career. Instead, he'd opened the repair shop, becoming a fixture in the Pasadena music community. Ray had not only given Eddie that broken guitar, but taught him how to fix it. Over the following months, 8-year-old Eddie would go to the shop almost every day after school, escaping bullies but increasingly falling in love with guitars. Ray never charged the poor immigrant family a single dollar. He taught Eddie not just how to repair instruments, but how to understand them, how to modify them, how to make them do things they weren't designed to do. Every technique Eddie would later become famous for had its roots in those afternoons at Torres Music Repair. But the story went deeper. Eddie revealed that Ray had continued supporting him through every phase of his career, always in secret, always refusing recognition. When Eddie wanted his first real electric guitar but couldn't afford it, Ray sold him a Stratocaster for $20, claiming it was damaged when in fact, Ray had spent hours fixing it perfectly. When Eddie was experimenting with modifications that would create the Frankenstrat, Ray showed him the techniques for rewiring pickups and restructuring the body. When Van Halen struggled to get gigs in the early 70s, playing backyard parties for almost no money, Ray quietly helped behind the scenes. He introduced them to club owners, vouched for their reliability, even loaned equipment when theirs broke down. And when Van Halen got their record deal in 1977 and everything exploded, Ray deliberately stepped back, refusing Eddie's offers to pay him back, refusing credit in interviews, refusing even free tickets to shows. Eddie's voice cracked as he explained he'd only discovered the full extent of Ray's early support months ago, when he returned to visit the old Pasadena neighborhood. The music shop had long closed, but Eddie tracked down old-timers who remembered those days. They told him stories about how Ray defended Eddie and Alex to neighborhood kids who mocked the immigrant brothers, how Ray sometimes paid for their guitar strings out of his own pocket while telling the boys it was leftover inventory. Eddie asked Ray if he'd be willing to play something with him, just like they used to in the back of the repair shop 45 years ago. Ray initially shook his head, overwhelmed, but Eddie gently insisted, and Wolfgang brought out a vintage acoustic guitar, the kind Ray used to play in his jazz days. What followed was unlike anything the Forum crowd had experienced at a Van Halen concert. Ray sat down and began playing a soft jazz progression, his fingers moving with 60 years of muscle memory. The style was completely different from Van Halen's usual high-energy rock, but there was something mesmerizing about the gentle, complex finger-picking that filled the arena. Eddie joined in, but not with his usual aggressive style. Instead, he matched Ray's gentle approach, weaving harmonies around the older man's lead in a way that showed he'd done this countless times before, back when he was just a scared kid finding refuge in a music shop. The two guitars spoke to each other, Ray's traditional jazz phrasing dancing with Eddie's modern sensibility, creating something beautiful and unexpected. As they played, Eddie spoke over the music, telling the crowd how Ray had been the first person to tell him that being different, being an outsider, being the weird Dutch kid, could actually be a strength in music. Ray explained that the greatest innovations always came from people who didn't fit the mold, who brought something from outside the mainstream. That lesson gave Eddie the courage to develop his own unique style, instead of copying what American guitarists were already doing. The revelation that hit hardest came next. Eddie explained that in 1984, at the height of Van Halen's fame, when they were the biggest rock band in the world, he'd tried to give Ray a percentage of his royalties. Ray refused completely, even getting angry, telling Eddie he hadn't helped a scared little boy because he expected payment decades later. He'd done it because that's what you do when you see someone who needs help. But there was more. During Eddie's darkest periods of addiction and alcoholism in the late 90s and early 2000s, when he was barely functional, Ray had been one of the few people who could still reach him. Ray would drive to Eddie's house in the middle of the night when Eddie called drunk and desperate, and they would sit in Eddie's home studio, not even always playing music, just Ray being present, being steady, being the same calm presence he'd been when Eddie was 8 years old. The crowd was silent now, many openly crying. This wasn't just about a musician thanking a mentor. This was about human connection across age, across culture, across the chasms that fame and time create. Ray had never wanted anything from Eddie except to see him survive and stay connected to the pure love of music that had saved him as a child. Eddie then shocked everyone, including Ray. He took off the Frankenstrat, the most famous guitar in rock history, and tried to hand it to Ray. The older man shook his head and tried to push it away, but Eddie insisted, explaining that this guitar had been built on the foundation Ray laid. Every modification, every innovation, every legendary sound from the Frankenstrat traced back to those afternoons when a patient man taught an immigrant kid that guitars were tools of possibility. Ray finally accepted it, holding it reverently, and Eddie guided his hands to play the opening notes of Eruption. As Ray's fingers found the notes, Eddie stood back and let the older man have the moment. Let him feel what it was like to play that legendary instrument in front of 25,000 people. Ray only played for 30 seconds before handing it back, overwhelmed. But those 30 seconds created a bridge across 45 years. Eddie told the crowd what they didn't know. He'd established a music education program in Pasadena 3 years earlier, funding it anonymously, that provided free instrument repair, free lessons, and free instruments to immigrant kids and families who couldn't afford them. The program was called the Torres Music Initiative, named after the man who gave Eddie his start. Ray hadn't known about the program's name until Eddie told him 2 weeks ago, when Eddie finally convinced him to come to this show. Eddie brought the rest of the band back on stage, and together they played a song they'd hastily rehearsed that afternoon. It was slower, more melodic than their usual repertoire, with space for Ray's jazz influences to weave through the Van Halen sound. Wolfgang's bass referenced walking bass patterns, Alex's drumming incorporated swing elements, and David Lee Roth provided subtle backing vocals. Ray sat on his stool, acoustic guitar in hand, and became part of Van Halen for one song, the band's sound evolving to include the roots that made it possible. When the song ended, the standing ovation lasted 15 minutes, longer than any performance response in the arena's history. People weren't just applauding a show. They were showing respect for the invisible support system that makes greatness possible, acknowledging Ray Torres and all the mentor figures in their own lives. Before Ray left the stage, he turned to the microphone one final time. His voice was soft, but carried through the arena. He said that Eddie had thanked him tonight, but the truth was that Eddie had given him something far more valuable. Watching the scared little Dutch boy become the confident, world-changing musician Eddie Van Halen had been the greatest privilege of his life. Eddie hadn't just succeeded, he'd stayed kind, stayed humble, and stayed connected to the community that raised him. The revelation became a defining moment of the 2007 reunion tour, sparking conversations about mentorship, immigration, and community support. The Torres Music Initiative became a model for similar programs across the country, and within 2 years, over 50 cities had established their own versions. Ray continued attending Van Halen shows for the remainder of the tour, always sitting in a special section Eddie designated, refusing backstage access beyond that. When Eddie Van Halen passed away on October 6, 2020, Ray was among the small group at the private funeral. Wolfgang later revealed that his father left specific instructions that Ray should receive one of Eddie's personal guitars. The story of Eddie Van Halen and Ray Torres reminds us that greatness rarely happens in isolation. Behind every revolutionary artist are teachers and mentors who see potential and nurture it without expectation of return. Ray's decision to help a scared immigrant kid in 1962 created ripples that reached millions through Eddie's music and thousands more through the educational programs Eddie established in Ray's honor. That September night at the Forum wasn't just about shocking 25,000 people with a mystery guest reveal. It was about showing the human connections and moments of kindness that make extraordinary achievement possible. The greatest guitar solo Eddie Van Halen ever performed might have been that gentle jazz piece with Ray Torres, because that was where the greatest guitarist of his generation acknowledged he hadn't climbed alone.